So today I want to review what it's like living in East New York, Brooklyn to Astoria, Queens. I've been in East New York, Brooklyn for about 2.5 weeks and then Astoria, Queens, living there for a week. And I wanted to compare my first impressions as someone new to living in such a big city. Now, first and foremost, my biggest impression is that, wow, New York City is big with so many boroughs, and you just get such a different feel and look to where you live, depending on which borough and which section of that borough you're in. I mean, think about Brooklyn. I was in East New York, but there's so many other regions: Williamsburg, Bushwick, Greenpoint, uh, Brooklyn Heights, and more that all look pretty darn different in a way. And Bushwick's kind of has more of that mural art, grungy, almost Texas feel. And then you have Brooklyn Heights, which is more of my favorite feel, which is classy but expensive too. You got the neighborhoods, and then you got the beautiful walkway with the ocean and the cityscape next to it. Now, for me, East New York was um, pretty much nothing to do there, and an hour train away from the heart of Manhattan. So it was your nice, quiet area. You wouldn't really get much problems with noise or parking or horns. But in Astoria, Queens, especially during rush hour, during the start and end of every business day, there was a good amount of horn honking and cars and movement. And so if you don't like the noise, something you have to consider. On the flip side, Astoria just has so much more access and connections, and it was just so much closer to all the areas you wanted to go. If you wanted to get into Manhattan, it was about 30, 40, sometimes 50 minutes in rush hour, but still noticeably closer than East New York. Now, I didn't really mind the commute, but that's something else you want to consider. The access was just great, something you may want to even sacrifice for the noise. Now, also, there's a lot more accessible stuff in Astoria. There's a BJ's, which is like a Costco. There was a giant, it was called a Stop and Shop, but it had the giant logo. It basically looked like a giant inside. Probably they did that for legal reasons, but they had a Stop and Shop. They had a Walgreens down the street that was open 24/7. That was fairly fully stocked. Not as extensive as some Walgreens I've been to, but good enough. They had a laundromat 1 block away. They had access to all these different ramen places and food places and Greek places and bakeries. Probably not as stacked as Manhattan, but good enough. So in terms of access to all the stuff, Astoria wins. I mean, when I was in East New York, there's basically nothing. There's a lot of very rundown, very limited, like grocery stores. They call them bodegas, and the selection there was super limited, and they were like probably a fraction of the size of a grocery store. They were almost convenience stores. So I think in terms of the place I stayed, it was fully decked with all this equipment, supplies for cooking, for eating, fully decked shower with Bluetooth music. It had a Roomba. Had all this stuff, but there really wasn't many choices to cook from. So it was kind of like a paradox. Like, I have all this stuff, but unless I were to like really go out of my way, I know they said the hosts of that place said that you could take an Uber out to a more stacked grocery store, but it would have taken about 10 minutes to get there, and that's a expensive price to pay. You have to pay $20-30 for Uber ride just for groceries. So that was the pros and cons. You have to work within them. So also Astoria, definitely it looked a lot safer, and the demographic was different. You're in Queens, so when I was on the train to my place in Astoria, the culture, the amount of people on the train was very much different. You had Greek people, Hispanic people, Asian people, white people. It was a huge mix of all these different cultures. But when I was going down to East New York, just because of how far down I was going into Brooklyn, it was almost always all African American and then me on the train. I was like the only non-African American there. And I didn't really have a problem with it. Um, and another thing was that when I went down East New York, it was just a straight shot down one metro, usually the C or A train, all the way down. If I wanted to get into Manhattan, it was usually a straight shot all the way down. For Astoria, I usually have to take a connection, at least one connection, sometimes two. Sometimes it's the R and then the 7 and then uh, some other ones, the A, the C. But the one benefit was that for when I was in East New York, I always got on the same train and I just could just sit there for 50 minutes, which I didn't mind. I could pop on a audiobook. I had to be a bit more alert in Astoria if I wanted to get in Manhattan because I had to keep switching trains. I guess the upside is, shorter commutes to an extent. Now, the Airbnb place told me on the listing it says 15 minutes to Manhattan. That wasn't actually true, at least not during the times I went, which were usually around 5 to 6 p.m. on the weekdays, and then like 11 a.m. on the weekends. Usually it was still around 40, 50 minutes, but usually it was a bit shorter. I have to give them some credit. It was sometimes 20 to 40 minutes to get where I wanted. So it really depends on what you want in terms of access. Now, I've yet to try Bushwick or Williamsburg, but I've walked through them. They look like really cool areas, a lot noisier, a bit more grungy, but definitely a lot safer looking than East New York. East New York, the architecture, there's a lot of cracked sidewalk places, graffiti on the walls, wasn't the safest. And then Astoria, if you just take a look at the look and feel of it, it's more of like it looks like a small town city in your average state more than part of New York City. It's like no real high skyscrapers, just like 1, 2, 3-story buildings, and then just like normal, somewhat grungy roads. So again, if you want that kind of street feel without it being a city, that's the place for you. For me, it was kind of like a little too less of a city for my personal taste. I would have, if I could choose anywhere, it'd probably be Greenpoint or Brooklyn Heights. Some people would choose Lower East Manhattan. But for me, I just found Greenpoint and Brooklyn Heights to be the most clean, nice looking, posh, exciting areas, and right by the water too. Some people immediately gravitate to Manhattan as, oh, this is the best place to be, but I've been in Lower East Side Manhattan too. Some of those areas were surprisingly pretty grungy as well in their own kind of, it was a more mechanical way because you were clearly in the city at that point. But, you look at the establishments there and a lot of them were kind of run down or like not the cleanest. So in that sense, I would have much rather preferred Brooklyn Heights for that reason. But then again, the prices there are obviously hiked. So that's my thoughts on Astoria versus East New York, Brooklyn.